Okay, so you have to excuse me if I read this presentation, but I wanted to kind of try and get a couple of different things in. So I first found out about Platypus online while I was doing my BA several years ago. And I was reading this book, Morning Becomes the Law by Gillian Rose, in which I found a striking critique of postmodernism and identity politics that seemed to dominate the left on campus where I was. And I was Googling around for reviews of her admittedly obscure work and discovered a review of her book Hegel Contra Sociology in the Platypus Review. That's funny, I thought. These Marxists are taking Gillian Rose more seriously than anyone else, and so began my education in Platypus. The opening line of that book, the first sentence, can serve as a prompt for tonight's talk. She writes, "It is strange to live in a time when philosophy has found so many ways to damage, if not destroy itself." Well, the same can be said of the left. We do live in strange times, not because of Donald Trump or Brexit, but because of the total absence of the left as a universal emancipatory force. And like Rose says of philosophy, the left's death has been largely self-inflicted. On Surviving the Extinction of the Left was written in 2006 and is in the trifold you all have a copy of. Except the gentleman who's just come in. There you go. Sorry. And which sets out the basis of the Platypus project. But perhaps it has a new resonance in this time of extinction rebellion and neo-Malthusian fears. If we are to survive the extinction of the left, which is the same as saying if we are to hold open the possibility for its reconstitution, then when the environmentalists say, "Time's up, act now," we must say rather, think again, reconsider, and think again. I hope to convince you that Platypus is the place to do that thinking. My task is to introduce the platypus, to tell you about its origin and goal. I will try to explain it and make it clear, but also to raise the problem of things yet unknown, problems still to be worked out, recognizing that there is a lot still to learn, recognizing our own limitations, is surely the jumping off point for any educational project, such as we are. I'll introduce names, terms, and propositions, and perhaps they'll be familiar to you, but also peculiar, and at first opaque because they might be counterintuitive. Some of these propositions might seem obvious and others might stick in your throat, and I hope this will provoke a lively conversation. Platypus was born in 2006 when a group of students in Chicago who had been participating in the protests against the Iraq War were confronted by the apparent frustrations and limitations of the anti-war movement. They asked their teacher in their class on the German Marxist and Frankfurt School intellectual Theodor Adorno to start a reading group investigating questions about the history of the left and how it got to the impasse that they could see right in front of them. Around that time, a founding member of Platypus came across a book in a second-hand shop called The New Left Reader. It was a collection of writings by prominent figures from the so-called New Left of the 1960s. From Frantz Fanon to C. Wright Mills, from Leszek Kolakowski to Mark Rudd. It was edited by Carl Oglesby, who had been a member of the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, one of the most significant groups of the 60s New Left in America. It seemed that the tasks and problems facing the young millennial generation in the anti-war movement were inherited, however distorted over time, from the New Left. The book formed the basis for that first Platypus reading group. Why was it that in 2006, 44 years after the SDS issued its famous Port Huron statement, the left seemed to have gotten no further, to be confronting similar problems, and in fact to have regressed below what was attempted by the older generation? What were the disputes and problems within the New Left itself, which had been forgotten by those who proclaimed its success, but which in fact persisted to haunt the present? How was the present conditioned by the failure of the left? These were troubling questions that demanded further elaboration. In addition to the texts that were collected in the New Left Reader, Platypus read a number of others, what we would consider critical or dissenting voices from within the New Left, people who try to read their own moment critically or against the grain, as Walter Benjamin puts it. These included Moishe Postone and Martin Nicolaus, Juliet Mitchell and John D'Amelio, Adolph Reed and Bayard Rustin, the polemics of the orthodox Trotskyists of the Spartacist League, and, most significantly, the Frankfurt School critical theorist Theodor Adorno. We still read all of these authors in our primary Marxist reading group here at LSE every Tuesday. All of those critical voices had something in common. Their attempt to critique the 60s New Left led them to raise problems and tasks inherited from the so-called Old Left of the 20s and 30s, from the Stalinism of the official communist parties, the reformist social democrats and trade union movements, and the anarchists and syndicalists in the Spanish Civil War, and also from the critics of those phenomena, namely the followers of Leon Trotsky, the Trotskyists, who split in disagreement after his death, as well as the Frankfurt School Marxists, Benjamin, Adorno, and Horkheimer. Where the issue with the millennial anti-war movement pointed to the undigested legacy of the 60s New Left, the problems of the 60s New Left pointed to the undigested legacy of the 20s to 30s Old Left. What were the disputes and problems within the Old Left itself, which had been forgotten by those who proclaimed its success, but which in fact persisted to haunt the present? How did the New Left, precisely in its attempt to break with the old, actually continue the liquidation of Marxism, which had taken place under Stalinism? How was the present conditioned by the failure of the left? Again, troubling questions which demanded further elaboration. Whereas the platypus, in zoological terms, is a strange mix between a mammal and a reptile, two apparently incompatible types, it has sometimes been said that our platypus is a strange mix between Trotsky and the Frankfurt School. Sometimes we are taken to be ultra-left Trotskyists, and sometimes we are taken to be academic critical theory nerds. Both of these are misrecognitions, which often say more about the person observing platypus than platypus itself, for they usually see in us what they don't like about the left. But then there is something true here too. It is the orthodox Trotskyists of the Spartacist League in the 60s, and the late writings of Adorno and Horkheimer that provide us with the most critical insights into the problems pertaining to the 60s New Left, precisely because they are self-conscious about, as opposed to minimizing or hiding, the legacy of problems inherited from the Old Left. What was the common thread between these two apparently opposed phenomena, Trotsky and the Frankfurt School? It was the insight that the problems facing the left of the 20th century, both old and new, were problems inherited from the crisis and failure of Marxism in the First World War and the revolutions that followed, the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the failed German Revolution of 1918 to 19. It is this defeat of the revolution that conditioned the disintegration of the left in the 20th century. And it is the tasks of Marxism that, rightly or wrongly, have haunted the left all the way through to the present. When Platypus declares the left is dead, long live the left, we don't just mean since the rightward moving accommodation of European social democratic parties to neoliberalism in the 1990s. We don't just mean since the collapse of the New Left in the 80s following the shock of the elections of Thatcher and Reagan, in which it retreated into the post-political realms of postmodernism and the culture wars. We don't just mean the left's support for reactionary nationalist and even Islamist movements in the Third World after the failure of the New Left. We don't just mean since the failure of the attempt to realign the Democrats in 1968 or 1972 US elections and the crack-up of the SDS into sectarianism and terrorism in 1969. We don't just mean since the left's accommodation to the welfare state in the 40s or 50s, or their accommodation to supporting the New Deal in the 30s. We don't just mean the accommodation to Stalinism's myth of socialism in one country, but we do mean all of that. The left has been dead since the failure of the Russian Revolution to spread to Germany and the rest of Europe, and thus become the international revolution its instigators had thought that it must be in the late 19-teens and early 1920s. This means that the left is dead not at a biological level. There are still leftists walking around, perhaps we are some of them, but at an ideological level. What passes for the left today is in fact another version of the right. But this doesn't mean that we can criticize the left by some abstract standard. We do not say, here is our program, bow down before it. For there is no clear program, whether literal or metaphorical, around which the left should organize today. The way forward seems blocked. What stands in our way are the ideological obstacles inherited from the past, the historical baggage of defeat that has not been processed, but rather accommodated to. What we do have, however, is history, the left's own history, with which to confront it in the present. How has the left fallen below the tasks and problems set by its own history, precisely while claiming to uphold that history in various different ways? This is the problem of historical regression, a term which is central to Platypus and comes from Adorno. We do not insist on regression in order to close up possibilities, but rather to open them for reconsideration. For without properly recognizing the regression that has taken place, we risk naturalizing it as progress, or with the hardy fighting spirit that says the struggle continues, thus liquidating the critical consciousness of the left and its political horizons to whatever seems achievable in the bad present. We maintain, this is a quote from the Trifold Fire, we maintain that past and present history need not indicate the future. Past and present failures and losses on the left should educate and warn, but not spellbind and enthrall us. Platypus seeks to provide an education in this history, which can act as a warning, but we will not be terrorized by it. We treat it soberly and with proper circumspection. What is the point of such an education? An education in the deep history of Marxism and the bourgeois revolutionary tradition from which it came, as well as an education in the various symptoms of the left's disintegration in the 20th century. Our goal is to dissolve ideological obstacles, which have amassed through the failure to properly process this history, in order to facilitate the possibility for reconstituting a Marxian left in the present, an improbable but not impossible task. How do we go about doing this? Allow me to tell you again about the origin of Platypus, but in a different way. As I mentioned, the students who founded Platypus had been involved in or around the anti-war movement in 2006. There they were confronted with a range of left-wing organisations, all part of the anti-war movement, but all with something different to say, particularly Marxist sectarian organisations, from the SWP in the UK and its ISO counterpart in the States, to the Spartacist League, as well as anarchists, liberals, and social democrats. While some in the anti-war movement embraced the defence of reactionary forces on the ground in the Middle East, from Hezbollah to the Ba'ath Party, others, such as Christopher Hitchens, supported the US invasion of Iraq, claiming not that he had abandoned the left, but that the left had abandoned him. All these groups and individuals claimed to be upholding the heritage of the left in some way, and all referred to the history of the left in some way to support their claim. For example, by citing Lenin's pamphlet, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, or by referring to the 60s Vietnam anti-war movement as some kind of roadmap to the present. Yet together, they seem to be fragments of a lost past that didn't add up to a whole. Platypus decided to host a public panel discussion and invite speakers from a range of perspectives on the left to address the same questions. The panel was called Imperialism, What is it and why should we be against it? We brought together leftists who wouldn't normally speak to each other, including Kevin Anderson from the Marxist Humanists, Nick Kreitman from the New Students for a Democratic Society, Danny Postel from OpenDemocracy.net, Adam Turl from the ISO, and Chris Catrone from Platypus. And you can read the transcript of this panel on the Platypus Review website. Why did we host such a panel discussion? Were we trying to convince the various leftists on the panel of the inadequacy of their perspective? No, not really. Rather, we were trying to curate an experience for our audience, which is us, students. A disquieting experience, no doubt. We want firstly to introduce our audience to perspectives that they are familiar with and those with which they are not, in a way that defamiliarizes both, to present the left as a historical object in the process of decomposition. It is supposed to be a negative experience about history. Since then, Platypus has hosted hundreds of public events in cities around the world, including here at LSE, where we've hosted panels on Brexit, on socialism, and on the crisis of neoliberalism. And we hope to host more this year with your input. Often we go to attend events put on by other leftist organisations in order to find out more about their positions, to ask them questions, and to educate ourselves on the history of their perspectives. We will often invite them to then speak on a panel or to write for the Platypus Review. The Platypus Review is another tool for hosting the conversation on the left. It's like our forum in print. We host perspectives from across the left, and we invite criticisms and responses to articles. We conduct interviews with aged leftists, and we publish transcripts of our panel events. We also have a German language Platypus Review, and have benefited from translating articles between the two. We have found that the Platypus Review functions in two ways. Firstly, it tracks the changes that are happening on the left as they happen. In that sense, it's an ongoing conversation in our present moment, responding to current events and trends. On the other hand, it acts as a historical record, which perhaps will only fully make sense to a reader in the future. It forms an archive tracing the death of the left. In both cases, as with our public events and our reading group, we're trying to make regression palpable. Can we feel the historical regression going on around us by brushing against the grain? Not long before our first panel event on imperialism, an organisation formed in Chicago calling itself the New Students for a Democratic Society, recalling the SDS of the 1960s. Some members of Platypus were early participants in the new SDS. At an early convention of the new SDS, members of the original SDS, veterans from the 1960s, came to speak to the millennial activists. They came with a warning. Don't repeat the mistakes that we did. Don't become fixated on the war as a single issue, as we did with Vietnam, and which led to our crisis and breakup. Did the millennial generation learn the lessons of the 60s New Left, or repeat its mistakes less consciously? Well, within a short space of time, the new SDS had broken up through internal splits, including with the Maoist Freedom Road Socialist Organisation, echoing the breakup of the SDS in 1969 with the Maoists of Progressive Labour. Not that the red baiting of the Maoists by social democrats in the organisation was any better. Ever since, Platypus has tracked the millennial left across its shifts and changes through the Obama election, Occupy, the Arab Spring, anti-austerity movements, Black Lives Matter, Syriza, Sanders, and Corbyn. In each phase, the left has recalled different parts of history in order to justify what it is doing in the present. In each phase, different left ideologies and different organisations have been more important, while others have been more critical, if relatively marginalised. It is our job in Platypus to track these changes and, simultaneously, to hold on against the grain to the original departure point of Marxism, from Marx and Engels through Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, Lukács, Korsch, and Adorno. The arc of our reading group syllabus, from the bourgeois revolutions through Marx, into the Second International Radicals, and through to the Frankfurt School, is supposed to unfold this bitemporal, i.e. two timeframes, operation. The reading group arms us for our encounters with the left at their events, on our panels, and in the PR. In closing, I want to make some brief remarks about two parts of what I just said. On the one hand, the present state of the millennial left, in the wake of Trump and Brexit, and the crisis of neoliberalism, and on the other hand, the meaning of Marxism in the present. for it is those two increasingly disconnected things which condition our project these days. All of the assumptions that the millennial left had developed over the decade from 2006 to 2016 were smashed by the election of Donald Trump and the victory of the Leave campaign in the Brexit referendum. In an article called "The Millennial Left is Dead" in the Platypus Review in 2017, Chris Patrone wrote, "They were not prepared to have the concerns of their leftism become accused by Black Lives Matter. Indeed, Sanders and his supporters were accused by Hillary herself of being an expression not merely of white privilege, but of so-called white supremacy. The millennials' leftism cannot survive all these blows. Rather, a resolution to Democratic Party common sense is reconciling the millennials to the status quo, especially via anti-Trumpism. Their expectations have been progressively lowered over the past decade. Now, in their last final round, they fall exhausted, buffeted by the anti-fascism on the ropes of 2017. A similar phenomenon manifested in the UK Labour Party, whose momentum group the millennial left joined en masse to support the veteran 60s socialist Jeremy Corbyn. But Brexit and Theresa May's election did not split, but consolidated the millennials' adherence to Labour. The much talked about millennial socialism of our time is of course nothing of the sort. Rather, it's a misrecognition of the crisis of neoliberalism in two ways. On the one hand, liberal opposition to the transformations led by Trump and Brexit seeks to amplify its rhetoric in hysteria and so reaches for the socialism label, just as Barack Obama's attempts at a New Deal in 2008, already forgotten and being rebooted as if it's just been discovered, were hysterically stigmatized as socialism by his Tea Party opponents. Obama was, of course, just a run-of-the-mill capitalist reformer. On the other hand, socialism is the name given to the policy decisions currently coming from both the left and the right to increase state spending and give workers a greater share of national product, which are a response to the crisis of neoliberalism. These policies have been a long time coming, and there is nothing inherently left-wing about them. What this focus on policy misses is how the crisis of neoliberalism is a crisis of its politics, of the political alliances and coalitions that made the policies of the past 40 years politically viable. In this country, the left has almost entirely collapsed into the Labour Party, despite whatever pretensions it had over the past 2 decades since Tony Blair to breaking with the Labour Party and forming a new socialist or working class party, or even pretensions it may have had to anarchism. There are now anarchists in the Labour Party. At the same time, the left has been confounded by Brexit and split over the issue, perhaps fatally, unable to decide whether the EU is an imperialist technocracy opposed to working class interests, or whether the Brexiteers in working class areas of England and Wales were racist nativists nostalgic for empire. The incoherency of both positions is not solved by some kind of halfway fudge, attempting to square the two, or, as some critics of identity politics like to put it, race and class. The problem with this is not its criticism of identity politics, but that its alternative is a milquetoast reboot of a New Deal, something the left would have once opposed. Amidst all of this, the avowedly Marxist organizations on the left have completely collapsed. The ISO in America folded, and if the SWP in this country hadn't gone into meltdown over its rape crisis in 2013, it would have done over Corbyn and Brexit. The memory of the left is indeed fickle, and organizational and ideological shifts are presented as if they were the necessary and obvious only way, covering over the internal divisions. It's hard to make palpable how different the left was even just 5 years ago, let alone 15 or 30. So where does this leave Marxism? The disintegrated and defeated tradition, which nonetheless has been invoked by the has been invoked by the left through the 30s and 60s to today. Who cares about Marxism anymore when it is merely an affirmation of what Corbyn activists already know to be true? Was the point of Marxism to elect Corbyn and have a Green New Deal? The current political crisis doesn't seem to generate even the vulgar Marxist attempts at economic analysis that were popular around the financial crash of 2008-9, for example, with David Harvey. Moreover, who cares about Marxism when everyone thinks we only have 12 years left before total planetary destruction is inevitable? The environmentalism of our time rejects ideological and historical questions as at best irrelevant and at worst nefarious wreckers of their plans for degrowth. Paradoxically, it is precisely Marxism's apparent irrelevance that strikes us as an opportunity to take a cold and sober view of the history of the left and of our present political crisis, as opposed to the hysteria we see all around us, and to reconsider in their own terms what Marx and his best followers took as their self-understanding. For their attempts to change the world failed, but it was the most significant failure. It was the greatest attempt to consciously change the world ever attempted, and the obscurity of our present moment is conditioned by that failure. Platypus has an unashamedly left-centric view of history. While there has been interest in recent years among some young millennials, particularly on the internet, in the so-called communist regimes of the Soviet Union and China, and their various satellites and third world nationalist Cold War allies, this millennial Stalinism, so-called, is just the flip side of millennial social democracy. It's an extreme way of being against Trump, and despite revolutionary rhetoric, supporting the Democrats or Labour nonetheless. Communism, here, becomes an affirmative ideology of the pre-neoliberal world, which the millennials reach back to nostalgically, only too late, for the neoliberal world is transforming. They are protesting against what is passing away regardless. Marxism, on the other hand, was a negative critique. Marx was not the foremost socialist or the inventor of socialism. He was the foremost critic of the working class socialist movement he found around him in England and France. Marx did not have a positive program against capitalism, but rather saw capitalism as the crisis of bourgeois social relations, which had once heralded freedom for all mankind. The point was not to realize the proletariat, the primary symptom of that crisis and self-contradiction, but to abolish it. Marx and Marxism was the historical consciousness of that crisis and self-contradiction, pointing the way to new tasks and possibilities for freedom, a concept long abandoned by the left. Surviving the extinction of the left, we must recover this critical and negative aspect of Marxism, which both informs and is informed by Adorno's characterization of the 20th century as regression. Sorry about my voice passing away there. Okay, who wants to jump in or has a question or contribution? Yeah.
So, where would you put the Platypus society on an ideological spectrum then? There's been a lot of interesting takes and framings towards certain members or groups in the leftist spectrum that kept me guessing where you guys actually do see yourselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, one way of answering that question is to say that Platypus isn't a political organisation. So we don't have a line or a programme, and so it actually is quite difficult to, locate where we would be on a political spectrum, so to speak. The way I try to address it in the talk is through different types of misrecognitions that people have of Platypus. So some people will say it seems like ultra-left. Some people will say, during the anti-war movement, Trotskyists would say Platypus is neoconservative. And neoconservative, well, we didn't really talk to any neoconservatives, but Adorno scholars would say Platypus is actually Trotskyist sectarians. Platypus is kind of trying to perform a negative operation with respect to the question of clarifying what the left is, which seems very unclear, because you can have all these perspectives
open to contestation in and of itself.
Right, and so we're trying to kind of clarify what the left was in order to think about what it could be. Thanks for coming.
So taking a distinctively historical perspective, then it's what I've been seeing in all of the Platypus' articles as well, that you focus on reflecting on how the left came into existence, what its struggles had been, but also one of the takeaways that I had from this talk is the line of argument that the left, as it has been, is dead, and that the new left is sort of a shadow of what it used to be, and therefore your analysis kind of went into a critique of millennial socialism, as you had put it. So to a meaningful extent, I'm actually with you here. The issue is that, yes, identity politics, from sort of a public policy analysis perspective, you could say it just occupies too much political space in political discourse, and therefore it sort of draws away from the class issue, and therefore you would need to combine both identity politics and class politics, but focus way more on class politics. It's what I, as a German member of the Labour Party, actually observe as well, is that we focus way too much on sort of this newly fashioned identity stuff, which in itself is indeed important, but at the same time, a shift that I had observed over the last couple of years was sort of a drawing away from the issue of social injustice that we're seeing with the continued existence of neoliberalism, with increasing wage disparities and distribution inequalities. But also the question is, what would the left need to do differently, or just in what respects it would have to actually be different to, in your view, be congruent with the historical issues that at some point in the future will pose itself, and they would be sort of have to master, if you will, whereas that is sort of a well-founded critique, or whether, to the contrary, society has changed so much over the last 50, 100 years that many historical perspectives aren't that viable in the current context anymore, and that rather this sort of process that we've been seeing with the left has been a natural evolution towards adapting towards this new society, which in some respects, again, you could say has its problems, and again, I'm totally with you there. But the question is, how exactly would the left need to be different, quote unquote, to be more in tune with the historically emerging problems that seem to resurface every once in a while?
So I'll try and respond briefly so we can bring some other people in. The issue here really is Marxism. So I don't know what a real left would look like in the present. Part of the provocation of the animal platypus is that it would be unrecognizable in a way. What we do have, however, are the claims and self-understanding of classical Marxism and of the left from the French Revolution and the bourgeois revolutions through to its kind of historically specific Marxism. And we can consider, well, okay, what did they think they were doing? And what did they think the problems were? And why? And that doesn't necessarily provide us with a roadmap to the present, right? As Trotskyist sectarians will say. However, it does pose problems that actually, our present is constituted by the legacy of that history in some way. It's not a total break from it. The other thing I'll just say is that I was actually criticizing the class and race perspective. I think it's not particularly fruitful to think about the problem with identity politics from a policy perspective, because what that is just saying is, well, we need to return to some kind of welfare statism, and the problem with identity politics is just getting in the way of us winning enough votes to pass our kind of New Deal. And the problem with that is that it's just a different form of repeating reruns without properly processing the failures. The left, Marxism, was originally opposed to things like the New Deal and the welfare state. And I think the class and race perspective really just fudges the matter, because it has a foreshortened historical perspective.
Can I just jump in? Well, the first thing that I was thinking about was, you said something on your point. The left is just today is just another form of the right, which I think you sort of slightly answered my question there, but basically I was sort of saying, so you're basically saying that they're, so do you presumably consider yourself a leftist? I mean, or do you organise politically as a leftist? And so what I'm saying is, do you think what you do constitutes the left, if you see what I mean? So even this, the whole Platypus thing, you think is not the left?
No.
Right, so it's, okay, I'm with you. I'm with you. And secondly, I was going to ask, so the thing you're basically talking about, the subsumption of a lot of the sort of leftists into the Labour Party or whatever. I sort of wanted to ask how pessimistic you are on that, in the sense that a lot of people, usually myself included, would probably say that there's, even if the Labour Party today isn't this obviously a vehicle for the left, like the actual material differences that can be made, or even if it's, so what I'm saying is that it does actually matter what happens in politics, even if it's not, sort of doing the left, if you see what I mean.
You mean to people's lives?
Yeah, so like there are real life impacts, and even if Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, okay, there won't be a rebirth of the left necessarily, but do you not sort of recognise the value in that on its own terms?
Sure, but that's not the kind of project of reconstituting Marxism. It's just got nothing to do with it.
So you're saying it's like not even the left is concerned?
There's a subcategory of this question, which is, to what extent would the rebirth of a left in the UK require some kind of strategic overthrow of the Labour Party through a relationship to it? That's a different question, though, from what you're asking.
No. I mean that's also in the back of my mind.
I know that's but I'm sure it's in the back. Yeah, it's always in the back of the question. You're asking a slightly different question at first, though, which is about don't crumbs to the starving make a world of difference?
Exactly. Yeah, that is the question I'm essentially asking.
I would perhaps jump in here. So it's sort of an ethical dilemma, if you will. On one hand, you have people like Gösta Esping Anderson who are saying, well, or just by providing a brief background here, he's sort of a Swedish social democrat intellectual, and he's had these pretty influential articles and books since the 1990s on welfare capitalism or the welfare state more broadly. And his line of argumentation as well, you could sort of take an approach of radical incrementalism, if you will, in that you sort of start as a centre-left reformer government, you strengthen your welfare state, and at the same time this would actually strengthen and mobilize workers, since they sort of from a Maslow hierarchy of needs perspective, they would have their basic needs taken care of. So they could go into education, they could attend rallies, they could be more politically active, much rather than be focused on their material needs and general survival. On the opposing side, you have people like Marx. Well, if you have a welfare state, or I guess in the modern context, if you have a universal basic income, and then thereby you have people's needs taken care of, this would actually, on a systemic level, demobilize them, as the grievances wouldn't be enough to have this much radical momentum and political force in votes, since people are going to be too comfortable to vote for something that will overthrow the current system, despite the fact that sort of from a long-term game theory perspective, they would actually be better off if they did it.
But isn't there not a natural extension of saying that? To say, so, okay, say the Tories or whoever decide to take away, more sort of. So what I'm saying is, a lot of the sort of the kind of embers of the kind of project of welfare, of the welfare state. If those continue to be extinguished, are we supposed to say, oh well, this is only a good thing, some kind of like accelerationist kind of thing?
Yeah.
Is that what you? I mean, is that not the natural extension of what you're arguing?
Well, I guess my personal perspective as someone who comes from broadly, I guess, an intersection between social democracy and democratic socialism, which is that we would have to go way beyond radical incrementalism, especially given our current challenges that are way too pressing to take things slow. But on the other hand, what's also not going to work is to have a, I guess, orthodox far left perspective and say, well, we're either doing this or we're just going to.
That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah. So well, I guess my personal perspective would be focus on the grand challenges, and then have an ideological truce towards certain areas, and be like, okay, we'll figure this out later, but first let's make sure that climate change doesn't kill us all, and then we could move on. And it is in this vein that I would argue that actually leftism moving into the Labour Party is more of a good thing than it is a bad thing. Reason being that on a grander societal level, there's never going to be enough people on the far left to form a majority government. Rather, what you would need to do anyways is to cooperate with reformist political actors, be it the Green Party, be it the Labour Party. And in this vein, it's actually pretty pragmatic to go into the Labour Party first, to not split up as a political force, and secondly, to move Labour more towards the left, which is what we're seeing right now, to sort of inside the party outweigh the more Blairist-leaning actors, which you also see in Germany as sort of conflict between people, which is like, okay, yeah, let's tax the rich a little, let's extend our welfare state a little, and then there's the other wing, which I am a part of, which is that's not enough. We have to focus on systemic change. We have to find alternatives to current systems. But again, what you would need to focus on, I guess, is a progressive, blunt force that has enough momentum to progressively, I guess, up the ante on political change, and focus on achieving certain things and have sort of an ideological truce towards other things.
How do you get the momentum though? How do you carry that momentum through to a point where you can actually make a change that you're talking about, where you have enough people convinced that this is the way forward? How are you going to carry on that momentum of, we're going to kind of try and push it through when you have the whole media establishment fighting against you on this? We've already seen most of it with it. If you ask the average person about what they think the left wing is, they think it's a wishy-washy thing that doesn't get anything done. Yeah. You've got to prove that quickly so people change their minds, in my opinion.
Well, in my mind, the first step would be an internal recomposition of progressive forces to come up with not per se a wholly unified narrative or program that much, I guess, would be too utopian, but say focus on pressing important issues, not only the, I guess, public goods or global public goods thing that inherently, which is also, I guess, a neo-Marxist perspective, are a bit bourgeois and not working class because they're so aloof to working class people. But say you sort of synthesize pressing global public goods with people's ordinary grievances, and thereby you develop a program that is up to the challenges. You focus on winning political debates, and then progressively you try to reconfigure the media system. You try to decolonize the media system from the capitalist system. Basically, you focus on certain leverage points that just stop rebound effects that would damage you in the long run. So first thing, I guess, would be eliminate systemic counter forces, and then progressively this would take some
Before
time.
we get the whole manifesto.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
That's all right. I mean, I think what's really interesting about this conversation is that we've immediately dropped the question of goals, and we're talking about means. And that's something that happens really quickly a lot in the history of the disintegration of the left, right? The question of aims becomes this like far off thing, and it becomes about tactics. And you find a lot of people suddenly become real hard-headed strategists. I think you see this a lot in the Labour Party at the moment, where people went from being kind of idealistic activists 5-10 years ago, and now they're like, oh, we have to be serious about strategy and getting the vote out here, and they know all these things about numbers. And the question that's completely gone out the window here is, what are we organising people for? Are we just organising them to have the state run society? Are we just organising them for a different form of capitalism, right? You can really mobilise a lot of people around that, and you can do a great job at it, but it's not socialism. And Marxism really posed the question of this relationship of the state and society in a quite different way that really is not in the picture at all here. And I think when you say, for example, that then there's, so you get your mechanism going, and then you're trying to shift people to the left. Well, what does that mean? What's the left? Is Jeremy Corbyn really the left? Well, that question, you're basically told to forget about it. And that's actually the nagging problem that underlies all of this. And so I think what I find often is people pursue the strategic, tactical question, and they actually come up against a lot of problems that have been gone through in the old left, in the 50s, in the new left, even in the 80s and 90s. You're immediately going to get people who say, actually we need to do more anarchisty type of activism outside Parliament, right? That's already a split that's kind of was present in the Corbyn movement right from the start, the so-called extra-parliamentary versus parliamentary. This is something going all the way back to the crisis in the Labour Party in the late 50s, perhaps even earlier with the Popular Front. And I think that the focus on strategy and tactics tends to bury the way in which history is actually still with us. We don't want to deal with it, right? It's too problematic to think that maybe someone tried this before and failed. That's like a nasty thought. So we'll just put that to one side and say, well, we'll try harder this time, right? Or we're going to do it differently. And actually there are nagging questions about the failures, but also about the aims, right? What are we actually aiming for, that get kind of swept under the carpet.
Yeah. Every 20 years or so they reappear, basically.
Right.
I think it's such a big thing that your aims have to be interlinked with your means. You can't, there's lots of different means of doing it, and your aims might correlate best with different ways. You're going to try and go for a revolution, you're trying to do revisions, what was it? I can't remember.
Radical incrementalism, so to speak.
But I think, with each mean, you're going to have a different way of forming whatever aim you're trying to do. So it's about having the aim, which, I don't know.
Well, the other thing I was...
matches the aim.
Yeah, and this is, so, I'll address that point in a second. I was just going to say one other point on this, which is, at the start you set up Marx versus...
Esping
Anderson.
Which was sort of an idealized counterpoint debate.
And I think actually the way you presented Anderson, Marx would agree with that. Marx doesn't have an immiseration theory. he doesn't think that the poorer and more downtrodden people are, the more likely they are to rebel. The poorer and more downtrodden people are more likely to probably become quite reactionary. Actually, Marx took for granted a well-educated, well-organised working class that was forming self-improvement societies of every kind under the sun, and that would actually attain to a level of political consciousness and organisation that it could run society, not be the idea that they're going to go from the most trodden down people. This is a kind of Maoism peasant revolt theory that is not Marx's. On the issue about aims and means, this is kind of most famously articulated by Rosa Luxemburg in her critique of Eduard Bernstein, the revisionist Marxist of the Second International, in her pamphlet, which we read in the reading group, Reform or Revolution. And she kind of flipped round a formulation of Bernstein's. Bernstein's formulation was, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. And she said, well, maybe the movement is nothing without the goal. And the issue was actually this quite profound and fundamental question about what kind of developments are possible within capitalism, right? And what a transition out of capitalism means. So whereas Bernstein thought that reforms within capitalism, which were being won by the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which was led by Marxists, and which was the largest working class, organised socialist working class party ever, he thought that those reforms were gradually developing socialism, within society, right? What Luxemburg said is all of these reforms are actually deepening the crisis, right? They are going to deepen the crisis, maybe to a point where there'll be a chance for a kind of revolutionary break, but actually the question of the state is still central, and the way that capitalism is constantly undermining itself is not going to go away through these reforms. So for the big example at the time, at the turn of the 20th century, was credit. Lots of socialists started thinking that credit would basically be socialism, right? That everyone would own stocks and shares, and that essentially the huge monopoly companies that were forming would just be commonly owned through the credit system that was already developing. And what Luxemburg said is credit is deepening the crisis. It's actually exacerbating and putting the crisis further into society. And what that led to, of course, was more state management. It didn't lead to socialism arriving.
I guess that's another line of argument, or another part of the problem that we would see within this ethical dilemma. Do we focus on fixing the symptoms now, or do we focus on essentially making a new system in the middle to long run? And what shall we do strategically, or what shall our aims be even? But I guess this dilemma, especially within the current context, is, while capitalism likes to throw all of us in a deep crisis every 10 or so years, so do we either focus on preventing such breaks, and this doesn't even, you could say, well, let's take it.
There's nothing that says that this is one way, that these rises and falls are natural and they should happen. Monetary
crunches within the global economy. So the question is, do you take an accelerationist viewpoint from the perspective of, let's focus on having a new system rather than try work within the old system? And on the other hand, you sort of have an IMF that is still neoliberal, but moving towards more a central left with some of its programs now, which is an interesting emergence, by the way. But anyhow, the question is also, shall we try to fix?
Can we ask?
Hell no.
What is the left?
What I've been saying is that the less
international Marxists.
So you know
the less sort of neoclassical.
Well, this is a good example actually of how capitalism is more revolutionary than the left. In fact, it's the left which is not international, capitalism is. It's our politics which is falling below. You know, there's a famous Lenin story where someone comes up to him in Switzerland or whatever during the First World War and says, are you the most radical, or like what's, and Lenin's response is, well, I don't know how radical I am or how radical you are, but the point is to be as radical as reality itself. And actually the left has, I'll address something else, but the left is conservative in many ways, and and has actually failed to lead change and rather tails behind it. And the example I gave of protesting against neoliberalism now, while the change is actually going ahead, is reminiscent of the way in which the left, which had once opposed the welfare state, became its last defenders in the age of neoliberalism. Now, you've both mentioned accelerationism. I know people use the term.
I guess if you can fix it
specifically
proactively, just let things run their course, right?
Well, yeah, I think people use it specifically to refer to a certain group of people. They also use it to mean a kind of catastrophism, right? They use it sort of like generally to mean like, well, like capitalism's going to drive things to the limit, and then like it's got to go somewhere. I don't think that accelerationism has anything to do with Marxism. I think it's like an interesting phenomenon. It has quite different theory of history, and that's key.
But I guess one common strain within accelerationism, it's a very pluralistic school of thought. I'm going to say it also has some right-wing connotations to it, but I guess from sort of a leftist view of accelerationism, one common strain or line of argument that you could identify is that capitalism basically brings about its own destruction, and it is in this way that you could say that within accelerationism, if you basically let capitalism run its course, it doesn't have to be sort of a historical determinism that it must do so. It's just a functionalist process that is diffusing within a global economy. But say for the sake of argument here, that the global economy, especially given the current state of the Chinese housing markets and sovereign debt, that this would bring about a new global financial crisis that may, just like in the 1930s, where we come to the New Deal again, would open up a political environment whereby radical change from the left would once again be possible, given that economic grievances within societies would be so high that you could move towards progressive policy programs.
But radical opportunity for the left in the 1930s did not materialize. We had the New Deal and fascism, and it was an absolute bloodbath. It did not progress humanity one iota.
The main critique of accelerationism is you're letting capitalism decide when it's finished. Because we said it.
Not that I want to.
Yeah, no, that's it.
But if we can do it proactively, we may have.
I think that's a really good point.
We may have a cynical opportunity.
When you, yeah, sure, maybe at the end, last minute, you go, okay, yeah, it's going to burn down. So that could be a backup plan in 100 years when they finally decide, okay, I think it'll be better to go over.
I mean, obviously, what's interesting here is, again, the question of acceleration has become about strategy and not about ends. But I think the point you make is really interesting, which is that accelerationism has no role for consciousness or subjectivity. And that's actually fundamental to Marxism, the idea of historical consciousness. Lukács is the author that we read in the reading group who kind of nails on this question specifically. if anyone is interested, I wrote a critique of Mark Fisher that's in the Platypus Review and talks about this, why he leaves out the question of consciousness and subjectivity. But I do think in a way, it's a response to the failure of the left, which is to say the left seems to get tangled up in all kinds of questions about politics and political subjectivity. And wouldn't it be nice if we could just forget that question and like Kantism was just going to roll off the cliff, and that so in a way all of these phenomena, these oppositions within the left and new phenomena that the left seems to throw up need to be understood as kind of as responses to defeat, whether consciously or unconsciously. Is there anyone who wants to jump in who hasn't had a go to speak yet? Did you have any questions? No? Did you have anything to say? You guys? Kieran, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it highlights the sort of talk. It highlights the necessity for historical consciousness, and I think that's come up quite a lot in the questions and answers. The need for a proper understanding of the means, the ends, and what it means to have an end in the first place.
That was a good Freudian slip.
Yeah.
And special needs so bad.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
So, is the left necessarily Marxist? That's basically what I'm asking you. I feel like a lot of the time, I don't mean this in a critical way, just in an interested way. You said things like that's blah blah blah, but it's not Marxism, and it's like you're up on a gold standard, which maybe it should be, but I'm asking, do you think that's the case?
So obviously, the left precedes Marxism historically, and ideologically, does include things which are not Marxism. It includes liberalism, anarchism.
Don't those things exist today?
They do exist today, sure, of course. Well, Marxists exist today.
What I'm saying is that you said that there's no left today.
Well, I didn't. As I said, I don't mean it biologically.
Right, okay.
I mean, for Platypus's purposes, we, when we're thinking about, okay, who do we need to understand? Who do we want to learn from? Who are we going to get on our panels? What interesting different perspectives are there out there? We will take people's self-avowed description. So if someone claims to be, this is why I raised the issue of Christopher Hitchens, for example, who said, I didn't abandon the left, but the left abandoned me.
Yeah.
Now, although many people would have considered him during the Iraq War a right-wing figure, he would have still been someone that Platypus would have said, well, if he claims to be the left, okay, we'll engage him. Because as soon as you start getting into what other people say about other people, then the game's over and you can't host a conversation, and you're not going to kind of critically enlighten anything. There's a funny anecdote, and now I'm going to butcher it because I can't really remember it, about Tariq Ali and Fred Halliday, I think. Is that right? That
It's about Allah, isn't it?
Huh?
It's about Allah.
It's about Allah.
One of you will go to the left and one to the
Yeah,
right.
that when they die, they'll meet Allah, and he'll say to them, you lived your lives as leftists, Marxists, whatever. Now one of you will go to the left and one of you will go to the right. And it wasn't clear, they'd had a political split during their lifetime, and it wasn't clear which one was which. Right? So, for example, the opposition I raised between, for example, the SWP, which supported the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, for example, and Christopher Hitchens, who backed the US going into Iraq. It's well, who's the left and who's the right?
Yeah.
Who goes which way?
Yeah.
It's actually unclear. So that Platypus is in the process of trying to kind of bring out that rather than pretend that, oh, we all know what it means.
Right. Yeah.
On the question of Marxism, though, the claim I made in the talk is that Marxism is the most profound and interesting failure. And it's the most profound and interesting inheritor of the left as a tradition going back to the bourgeois revolutions. The concept of freedom, history, society, all of these things. So that's the reason why I'm kind of using it as the gold standard, as you put it. If I'm quite, I think that, for example, if I say accelerationism has nothing to do with Marxism, I still think accelerationism is part of the self-avowed left. And whatever about the differences in accelerationism, we can talk about that later. And I think the reason for saying it's not Marxism is kind of not to say and that's their fault, but to say, can we actually be ideologically conscious and coherent about what Marxism was?
Yeah.
So a funny thing, this is the example that I used when I talked about Mark Fisher. In capitalist, are people familiar with Mark Fisher and capitalist realism? In capitalist realism, which is his short book from 2009, he quotes from the Communist Manifesto, and it's the famous passage which says, the bourgeoisie has, got rid of all feudal rights and all, all of the old ways, and all that is solid melts to air, etc., etc. And Fisher quotes this passage, and he takes out the words the bourgeoisie, and he puts in square brackets capital, right? And then I was doing research, and I found on Nick Land's blog, Nick Land, who's the so-called right accelerationist, he does exactly the same thing. He has a really long quotation from Marx, from the Communist Manifesto, and he takes out the words bourgeoisie and he puts capital or capitalists. And then Nick Land just has this one comment at the end, and he says, he doesn't change it, sorry, he keeps the quote as it is in the Communist Manifesto, and then he comments at the end, if Marx and Engels had changed the words the bourgeoisie for capitalists, their accelerationist credentials would have advanced considerably. Now, what Nick Land is saying is, I know that what I'm doing here is changing Marx and Engels significantly, and that therefore there's a significant difference between Marxism and accelerationism, right? You would have to make a key change in order for Marx and Engels to become accelerationists. What Mark Fisher does, because he's a so-called left accelerationist, is he makes the same change, but he doesn't say anything about it. In fact, he pretends that it's Marxism, right? He ends with this chapter, Marxist super nanny. And the point of saying accelerationism isn't Marxism is not to be and therefore you're bad people, or that's the wrong idea,
so
but it's to be... Yeah, no, I know, but it's an interesting example. It's just to get that clarity, right? Is to say, to stop the regression of Marxism, because the move is exactly the same with Stalinism. Right, it's the classic example. Stalin says socialism in one country is now Marxism, right? And the point of the critique of Stalinism was to say, actually, Marxism was something else. And
Right, so you're saying it's because people are it's because they're trying to claim Marxism. That's why you're interested in it.
Yeah.
Just bit unrelated parts, but obviously I understand the importance of understanding what the left was through bringing together people that are, by their credentials, being just self-avowed leftists, and listening to what they're saying, contrasting their perspectives and comparing it to historical left. But do you think from that you can build, from the critique of what the left was, you can actually lead to a coherent what the left could be?
No. not directly. I mean, Platypus is, first of all, one thing to say is Marx was a critic of the existing working class movement for socialism. You know, the Marxists in the Second International had a critique of the Second International, right? That's not what Platypus is doing. We don't have an object like that. There isn't a left that we can critique in that way. What we can do is this kind of negative historical operation of trying to bring to consciousness what the historical obstacles are. Now, that is a very limited part of what would be required for reconstituting a left. Actually, there would be a great deal of practical, you know, organising necessary and politics. And Platypus is quite clear about the fact that we're not doing that. There might be a point where Platypus changes and, you know, people break off and do different things.
Yeah, no, the point I was trying to say was, I'm not trying to claim that Platypus should start towing some sort of line or whatever.
Yeah.
I was just trying to say that, is there a risk that through just understanding the lines and divisions and cracks in what has been the sort of curvy wobbly road of how the left develops in this timeline, and understanding how it is now, understanding those divisions, will it do anything to stop them just repeating themselves?
Let me put it a slightly different way, which is, if the left is disappearing and we're kind of like soaking up all the knowledge, aren't we going to be the last obstacle? Right? That we're just going to reproduce it instead of overcoming it. I think that the difficulty here is that it's a negative question, right? It's learning. What we're learning from all of this history is essentially what not to do, but we're not learning what to do, and that would still kind of pose the problems of that are produced within capitalism, which the left confronted over the past.
I was just thinking maybe
years.
Perhaps it's circular, because the question of what to do is in a lot of cases what creates these divisions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but our point is, faced with that knowledge, that the what must be done question actually produces more division than unity at the moment. That doesn't mean we should hide away from those questions. Of not the what must be done questions, but the like historical, ideological questions. The questions which seem to manifest in those splits. Because, you know, for example, this will be like a common argument used by people who are trying to transform the Labour Party, which is essentially just put those questions to one side. And actually, the counter proposition from Platypus is you have to go through those problems. There's no like getting around them, save them for a rainy day kind of option. And that I think that perspective has been vindicated by the fact that all the attempts to put them off, you know, in a kind of Freudian metaphor, all the attempts at repression have just brought the symptoms back in a more intense way later on, or in a more degraded way, or less conscious way, or something like that. Does that? I'm basically saying you're right, and that's the problem that we have to face. But you know, our aim is to kind of stare those problems in the face. To not turn away.
I'm not trying to like grill you or anything. Obviously,
no. I mean,
a lot of class events and like Platypus. I'm just saying. I was just interested in what you would say.
Yeah. No. Well, I mean, I think that I've kind of mentioned it in the presentation, but it is funny that the current wave of environmentalism does have this extreme emphasis on act now. And one of the things we read at the very end of the reading group is Adorno's kind of last writings from the 1960s, his critique of the student movement in Germany at the time, what he called pseudo-activity or actionism. There is a way in which trying to put aside the ideological questions in order to get around some commonly agreed things in order to act now is a sign of despair. So I'm particularly thinking of Adorno's piece Resignation, and that what sometimes seems like the most virulent protest is in fact a kind of expression of despair and accommodation.
But I guess at this point it would be somewhat justified, this despair, in that there's indeed not much time to actually for progressive forces to quote unquote get their act together. But I totally see your point here. It would have to happen under the rubric of as quickly as possible and as slowly as needed, in that in order to be able to act in the first place would first need to arrive at a reasonably common perspective on what we actually want to do, and that's in my previous lines of argumentation always what I had presupposed, and that we reach major consensus on the things we want to focus on, and then conflict with everything will be inevitable, but can you really say that, well, we'll just focus on sort of meddling through our differences, and then in this sort of incremental process, in a few years we have it all worked out and then we can go to work? But I would actually see it in the way of we have to find a common ground and perspective on the more fundamental things, like getting over capitalism, providing a dignified life for the 10 billion people that we're going to be, climate protection, sustainable development, things like that. That this is sort of where my global public goods perspective now comes in again. But say that we take time figuring this out, that we intensify dialogue across the leftist spectrum, that having arrived at this not perfect but good enough consensus, that then we can go into the strategy realm, if you will.
That's not what Platypus is doing.
I know, just sort of the historical perspective.
Good to meet you, thanks for coming. We'll hope to see you at the reading group or coffee break on Friday.
Sure.
We'll wrap up in a minute. It's not, Platypus isn't a sort of operation of let's all get together and hash this out and then we'll find the common principles and then we can go forward. It's actually rather totally divorced from that kind of thing. When we have the panel, we're not trying to get all the panelists to at the end be like, okay, well, going forward to our next meeting, this is the one principle we've decided. We're not trying to convince the panelists of anything. We're trying to curate an experience for the audience, which is to experience the death of the left, right? To actually have a moment of recognition.
What a great experience.
It is a profound experience, and that will somehow, have this kind of negative effect. I don't think that when it comes to the practical reconstitution of the Marxian left, that for example, philosophical agreement is a necessary precondition for political organizing. I don't think things can or should necessarily all be worked out in advance. And this raises the issue of a kind of another Adorno thing, which is the separation of theory and practice. Right? The questions which we're trying to isolate and identify from the history of the left and the history of Marxism are not going to provide answers to what should be done in the present. And if there is a reconstituted practical political force, it's going to require actually its own critique, which will be non-identical with its own its own practice. And Marxism was that auto-critique of the Second International. Right? Marxism is not identical with the workers' movement for socialism. It's a historical consciousness of why the workers' movement for socialism is self-contradictory. Right? It's actually going to, because the workers' movement is trying to realise labour rather than abolish it, for example.
Where's the reading group and when?
Done?
The reading group is every Tuesday in the room above us, KSW 2.02.
Yeah.
You can find us on Facebook.
Yeah, or you can take one of these, it's got information.
Also, if you're interested in one of these panels where you can experience the death to left, we got one coming.
That should be the tagline.
Oh yeah,
That's
that's
online.
Yeah.
The worst pub in South East London.
That's
Not underage kids, but I'm sure they'll be
Perfect for that topic. I think there's this issue of the non-identity of theory and practice. So again, that's something that kind of disappears from much of the conversation on the left, which becomes about, even in its self-consciously theoretical discussions, the non-identity of theory and practice is not necessarily observed, and agreeing around political goals is confused with agreeing around theoretical questions. And you see this then ends up badly influencing the way people read history. So they read, for example, the Marxists of the Second International, they read Kautsky, Lenin, Luxemburg, and they can't distinguish between propaganda and theoretical disputes, right? Actually, these were political figures who wrote in a number of different registers. And so when people, for example, read imperialism, the high stage of capitalism, as the response to the Iraq War, they are actually confusing historical and theoretical questions for agitation and propaganda. And that's because they confuse them in their own present. And so they read history that way. So in the reading group, we know that it's a liability that Platypus, quote unquote, doesn't do anything, right, isn't political. But we actually think that how can we turn that liability into an asset? It's an asset to being actually able to think about Lenin's self-understanding rather than making him conform to the needs we have in the present. For example, people use Lenin to justify their entry work in the Labour Party today. Because of what he wrote in 1920 about the Labour Party and the Communist Party. And they historically flatten it, and they, compare apples and oranges. And you lose both an insight into what Lenin was saying, and you lose an insight into actually what's going on now, which could be more interesting if you were more honest about the historical discontinuity than trying to claim, continuity. In that sense.
Can I just ask though, do you think that separation of theory and practice is ever actually practical, possible? I mean, realistic. I mean, in a kind of lived context. I mean, and also, is it on a personal basis or an organisational basis? Or?
Well, in the Marxism of the Second International, it was articulated through the party. Right, so the party mediated this problem of theory and practice. They were often in conflict with each other, and had internal contradictions. Right, so Luxemburg and Bernstein is a theoretical dispute, but there's also a practical dispute going on at the same time about the role of the trade unions in relationship to the party. And what's really hard for us is in the absence of a left. I think this is one of the ways of kind of negatively identifying the absence of the left. Because it is difficult to talk about what's not there. is that it's so hard for us to imagine that kind of articulation, and we can only kind of talk about the historical precedent. As soon as we try to imagine it now, we seem to come up across, it just seems to disintegrate. Rather than treating that as a problem of our own thinking, we should recognize it as a symptom of our historical situation.